it's definitely the case that in the United States in particular, native-born Black Americans are underrepresented in positions of authority, power, and economic dominance, right? Okay. And so you might say, well, that's a consequence of systemic racism. And there's no doubt an element of systemic racism. The question is, how much of the outcome is that accounting for? Okay, so, and you might say, well, we could use that as the default hypothesis given the history of slavery, and which is clearly unacceptable in every possible way morally, although pretty much par for the course for most human societies throughout history.
Right. And Jim Crow and other discriminatory policies afterwards.
Right. So you say, well, systemic racism, and fair enough. That's a reasonable hypothesis. Well, except that there's a disproportionate number of other minorities who are overrepresented in pinnacle positions. And in fact, that is happening compared to the Caucasian, the native-born Caucasian group. Indian Americans, for example, their family income now is almost twice that of the typical median Caucasian family, twice. And the top 6 or 7 are all Southeast Asian. So then you say, well, if it's systemic racism, what about, maybe you could write off the Indians and the Muslims because they're more or less Caucasian. And I don't mean that positively or negatively, but then the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, they're more visually different than Caucasians, but they're doing just fine too. And then if you assume systemic racism, it also blinds you to all sorts of other factors, as we already discussed, that might be contributing. So I know, for example, and I looked into this 20 years ago, that it looks like it's the familial structure and ethos of Southeast Asian first-generation immigrant families that are producing overperformance in their children. That disappears by the 3rd generation as assimilation completes itself. So among Southeast Asians, the emphasis on conscientiousness, essentially, perhaps with an additional, what would you call it, positive aspect of higher likelihood of intact family, 2-parent family. There's this emphasis on conscientiousness, and conscientiousness is essentially hard work. Southeast Asian students, that's children of first-generation Southeast Asian immigrants, do homework, spend many more hours on homework. Well, conscientious striving actually does predict success. And the data that I reviewed, this was 2 decades ago, indicated that the typical Southeast Asian child gains competitive advantage from the conditions of their upbringing that's equivalent to 15 IQ points. And that's a huge difference. It's the difference between someone who's normal and someone who's borderline impaired, mentally handicapped. It's the difference between the typical high school student and the typical college student. It's a walloping difference. Well, now, if you're blinded by the fact of racism to everything else, because racism exists, then you're not going to be able to decompose the problem and say, well, look, those Southeast Asians, they're outperforming Southeast Asians who are 3rd generation in the US, also Caucasians. Why? Well, it looks like there's familial structure issues and an emphasis on work. Well, you don't want to miss that, man. It's actually important.